This is the Sony Xperia XZ2. It's a phone completely different than any other phone Sony's ever made, but it takes some design cues from previous devices in its lineage. And while older Xperias were sharp-cornered bricks of devices, the XZ2 is feeling a lot more natural. And I mean that quite literally. The Xperia XZ2 is designed around water. Sony wants this thing to fit perfectly in your hand, and the shiny back reflects, well, pretty much everything. This is one of the most reflective devices I've ever used, and it honestly reminds me a lot of the HTC U11. The phone's even waterproof with an IP68 rating, which fits pretty nicely around the whole ambient flow design philosophy. If you only saw this phone from the front side, you'd probably be tricked into thinking that Sony hadn't changed the design at all. It's really squared off like the previous Xperia phones, but it does have slightly rounded corners that might give it away as an imposter. The other subtle difference here is the addition of dual stereo speakers. Sony's added a very thin slit at the bottom to send sound towards you, and it's also using the earpiece as a secondary speaker. Now, these speakers actually sound really good, and I'm actually preferred them to the Pixel 2 XLs, though they didn't seem to get quite as loud. Sony's also completely redesigned their vibration system with what they call a dynamic vibration motor. This is much larger than typical vibration systems, and it was designed to immerse you in your media. This happens with video, music, and really anything that makes sound from your phone. After testing it with music and movies, I found that it's really nothing more than a gimmick. I'm glad Sony put more thought into the haptics on this phone, but I'd really have preferred that they focused on making the vibration motor as good as the iPhones before mixing it in with media. The XZ2 is using a 5.7-inch 1080 by 2160 panel at 424 ppi, and it honestly looks great. Sony hasn't switched over to OLED yet, but I am totally fine with LCD for now. It's still pretty difficult to get a good OLED panel unless you're one of a few select manufacturers, and I'd prefer that Sony used a great LCD display before using a mediocre OLED one. The screen's HDR compatible too, meaning you can watch all that new content with less banding and a much wider range of color. There isn't a ton of HDR content out there right now unless you're using a streaming service like Netflix, but the phone can actually upscale non-HDR content to look better than it did previously. They included a copy of the Jumanji trailer on this thing to demonstrate the HDR effect, and it actually looked pretty good. When you turn this thing over, you'll really start to see where Sony changed the design. The phone's pretty thick at 11.1 millimeters, but I really didn't mind. The thicker rounded design makes it easier to hold, which is really important with this phone because otherwise it's a little unwieldy. The fingerprint reader and camera lens are really just placed in the wrong spots. Almost every time I picked up this phone, my finger landed directly on the camera lens. Sony says that they went with this omni-balance design to help make it feel evenly distributed, but I would have preferred that this was a little top-heavy if it meant the fingerprint reader and camera were in a better spot. The XZ2 is slippery, like really slippery. It fell out of my pocket probably a dozen times this week, and now I've got a number of hairline scratches on the screen. I ended up needing to set it face down on the table while I worked, and even then it made me a little bit nervous. The rear camera is 19 megapixels, and it was honestly pretty disappointing. This is an HDR enabled camera that can shoot 4K video, but the quality was just lacking. Photos didn't seem to adjust well to different lighting situations, and the highlights almost always seemed blown out. Low light shots resulted in smeared images, which I can only assume was the fault of badly adjusted shutter speed, and I really hope that Sony improves on this camera in their dual lens Xperia XZ2 Premium. The selfie camera is sadly equally as bad. It's 5 megapixels, which is a little bit low for today's social media fueled world, and the images came out looking pretty soft. Other manufacturers are rapidly making these front cameras better, and I'd really like to see Sony jump on that train. Ignoring the bad quality of the camera itself, Sony stuffed in some interesting features to make this phone more valuable for a small subset of users. The 3D imaging feature is back, and it produces higher quality models than last year's model. Sony's enabled the front-facing camera to model your own face, and I was actually pretty surprised at how well it worked. This is a really niche feature though, so it's only really valuable if you're a 3D animator or just want a 3D bust of your own head. Sony's also reintroduced the 960 FPS super slow-mo feature at an updated 1080p resolution, but the footage just looked bad. I tested this in an extremely well-lit environment, but the video still came out super grainy. It's fun for a good minute, but it's definitely unusable for any serious projects. When it comes to the internals, the XZ2 is one of the best phones you can get right now. It's got Qualcomm's latest Snapdragon 845 processor, 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and 4GB of RAM. Now you could definitely fit some more RAM in there, and I'd love to see the storage expanded to 128GB, but the 4GB of RAM was more than enough for everyday use, and having the option to upgrade storage is awesome. Some other phones manage RAM much worse than this thing, and I never saw any lag during multitasking with a variety of apps. Performance was the least of my issues here, and I'm really glad that Sony made their Android Oreo skin so simple and uncluttered. That 845 is actually pretty great with battery life. I saw about 6 hours of screen on time with the 3180 mAh battery, and the phone charged up really fast with Qualcomm's Quick Charge 3.0, though I'm hoping that they pick up 4.0 in the next version of this phone. Sony's new phone reimagines what the Xperia line is meant to be. Its spec'd out internals, wonderful screen, and great speakers make it a strong contender. But does its awkward shape, gimmicky features, and $799 price tag still make it worth a purchase? While I like this phone quite a lot, I'd probably wait to see what OnePlus and Google do before jumping into a new Sony flagship. So that's the Sony Xperia XZ2. If we missed anything you'd like to know more about, make sure you leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and stay tuned to our socials and website because, of course, we are your source for all things Android.